New details on Jeffrey Epstein's death are coming to light. Records obtained by the Associated Press reveal that 2 weeks before he allegedly ended his life, show that, according to the observations of jail officials, Epstein was agitated and unable to sleep. He reportedly called himself a coward and said he was struggling to adapt to life in jail after his arrest in July of 2019. AP also reports that Epstein was under psychological observation at the time for a suicide attempt days earlier that resulted in his neck being bruised and scraped.
However, after a 31-hour suicide watch, Epstein said he wasn't suicidal, and he told a jail psychologist that he had, quote, a wonderful life and, quote, would be crazy to end it. On August 10th, 2019, Epstein was found unresponsive in his cell and was reported dead that morning. AP has obtained more than 4,000 pages of documents related to Epstein's death from the Federal Bureau of Prisons. So, sounds like he wasn't suicidal. Sounds like maybe he didn't commit suicide.
Wow, gasp. No, you can't say that, Jessica. These documents from the AP, which were apparently from the Federal Bureau of Prisons, I mean, come on, does anyone buy this at this point? It's basically common knowledge at this point that he allegedly did not kill himself. We have to say allegedly still. But if it is the case that he killed himself, why on earth would a psychologist take someone who was on a 31-hour psychological hold on suicide watch and have them just say, I have a wonderful life, I don't want to kill myself anymore, and believe it and take him off suicide watch? I mean, at the very least, that psychologist should be out of a job.
Yeah, he could have honestly been extraordinarily suicidal. And then he was like, well, I'm having an even worse time when I'm on suicide watch than I was before. So I'm going to say whatever it takes to get out of this. I don't think we have our nation's brightest serving in the prisons as psychologists. I believe there are probably many good people who are very good at what they do serving in the prisons. Do I trust all of them to do a 100% job all the time? No, it's not a very attractive job to be a psychologist in the prison. And so I don't know if it's our nation's brightest serving in those prisons.
Yeah, I just keep going back to all of the weird circumstances surrounding his death. The fact that the cameras supposedly weren't working in some cases. In other cases, the footage got lost. The weirdness of how physically he was able to commit the act given the way that the cell was set up. Everything about it is just strange, and it feels like one of these Occam's razor situations where the likeliest explanation or the simplest explanation is probably the correct one, and it just seems easier to acknowledge that he probably didn't kill himself than to have to explain all of the bizarre extenuating circumstances that don't really seem to have a good explanation for them.
Yeah, and let's not forget that we don't really see prison guards have a high regard for human life when it comes to the prisoners that they work to, I don't want to say serve, but they work in the prisons where they have to manage the prisoners that are in those prisons. I don't think they have a high regard for human life in prison. I think that's very clear when we think about the circumstances of prisons across the country and how frequent violent deaths and suicides happen and how frequent neglect is of prisoners who are in terrible medical conditions. So, is this intentional neglect where, the guards were not around and someone came in and killed Jeffrey Epstein? I can see a world where that's possible. I can also see a world where it's just like many other prisoners are treated with neglect, and he was actually suicidal because the people working in prisons don't have a high regard for the lives of the prisoners. I can honestly see it go both ways, but when we think about the power and influence of Jeffrey Epstein, maybe, as you said, Occam's razor suggests that people wanted him dead. People really didn't want him to be able to testify and be put under oath and potentially talk about other people that were involved in his unsavory activities on his island.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a plethora of reporting has been coming out over the past couple of weeks regarding previously unknown connections between Jeffrey Epstein and Jamie Dimon, for example, who we were talking about earlier on the show. They were apparently friends or something to that effect. And there was a lot of high-profile people who are connected with Jeffrey Epstein who would be incentivized for him not to be able to testify or reveal who he was actually in cahoots with in terms of the pedophile ring that he was running. And most of the researchers who have looked into how he did business basically reached the conclusion that he would use the participation of these high-profile individuals in the pedophile ring in order to get them to keep their money with him and for him to manage their money. And that was how he became so wealthy. Not to mention the fact that he would take people down on his jet to this private island where all kinds of weird shenanigans were going on. And the fact that in Ghislaine Maxwell's trial, we learned that there were tons of people that she was responsible for grooming young girls for so that they could rape them or sexually abuse them. And yet we weren't allowed to learn who those names were, who those people were. It was all kept under lock and key, even though it was of obviously evidentiary value to the investigation into the case itself.
Yeah, it's really revealing a side of business dealings that is maybe more common than we think, just looking at the Jeffrey Epstein case. So many business dealings happen overseas where sex work is legal or more common. And so when you think about the types of mergers and acquisitions that happen at these conferences overseas, it's not something that a lot of folks report on. But it is pretty common to talk to someone who has worked at Amazon in the early mergers and acquisition days, for example, to ask about what kind of business dealings were happening. When you have things going down in foreign countries with multinational corporations and everybody goes out and gets drinks, you can talk to people and ask what kind of activities went down. There's a certain kind of collateral that happens when you cross that line and you know of someone who's been involved with a sex worker overseas. Blackmail being the premise of a major business dealing, I think, is far more common than just the Jeffrey Epstein case.
Sure, and that's what they tried to get Trump on initially in terms of the dossier, was the idea that he had slept with a Russian hooker and engaged in some kinky, weird fetish, and that there was a recording of it that the Russian government was using to allegedly blackmail him. Also, according to the documents obtained by the Associated Press, Epstein tried to contact the disgraced U.S. gymnastics team doctor Larry Nassar while in prison. Bombshell alert, that's really bizarre. Of course, Larry Nassar was convicted of abusing all kinds of young gymnasts by posing as, well, he was a doctor, but he was basically using that position of power to abuse these girls under the auspice of providing them medical treatment. The fact that these are two guys who were in jail, of course, Epstein, pending trial for the trafficking of young girls or the abuse of young girls, is really bizarre. I wonder if they got in contact, and if they did, what exactly it was they talked about.
Yeah, it's just the list of people who have this amount of money is short. And among that list, those who are not using their money and power and influence to do extremely unsavory things, I don't think that exists. I think it's sickening when someone has that much influence, when you have billions of dollars, when you have hundreds of millions of dollars. I think you lose a little bit of your humanity. And I don't know if it's required to maybe not have a full moral compass to be able to amass that amount of wealth. Just thinking about the exploitation necessary to get to the point of having billions of dollars or hundreds of millions of dollars. But then I think about, like, maybe the problem is that you have to have such low moral values to get to that point. Or is it the case that having that amount of money and power ends up corrupting you? I'm not sure. It's a chicken or the egg situation. But I think it's just another piece of evidence in the case for really reeling in extreme wealth in our society. We should have some sense that there's an amount that's too much, and it's good monetary policy to say, you shouldn't be allowed to hoard X amount of dollars. It's bad for our economy, and it's bad for our monetary system, and for morality and the poor women that were at Epstein Island.
That's it for us today. Jessica, it was great to be back with you this week.
Yeah, it was great being here with you. We ended on a banger.
Absolutely. We'll see you next week. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we are now available anywhere you listen to podcasts. Thanks for tuning in to Rising. See you next Friday.